Welcome back, Troglodytes, to your daily dose of guitar information, the Trogly's Guitar Show. Today we're going to learn about the Edwards Mini Les Paul, better known as the Edwards ELP50CM model. Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering, what on earth is Edwards? Because in the United States, this is not a brand that you can buy brand new at a store. This is a sub-brand of ESP. Now, you've probably heard of ESP, and you normally think, isn't their sub-brand called LTD for limited? Yes, but they actually have 3 additional variants called Grassroots, Edwards, and Navigator. And to the best of my knowledge, that's within their rankings. These are the rip-off brands of ESP. Basically, they will make any type of guitar from any other company that you could imagine. So there's like P basses, there's jazz basses, there's Les Pauls, there's Telecasters, Stratocasters. I mean, take a look at their website over in Japan and you can see everything that you can buy at an affordable price from a different company. But you can't buy them here in America. They're Japan exclusives only. So to sell this guitar would actually be illegal if it was brand new at a dealer. But since some people get curious, some of them do make their way to the States. People will pay the outrageous shipping prices and the import duties and all that stuff just to see what all the hubbub is about. So this one is the ELP50CM. It's basically a mini Les Paul custom. And it's not the first mini guitar that we've talked about on this channel. One of my more popular uploads was my Les Paul Pee-wee series, where I just upgraded the crap out of that thing with like $800 worth of parts. But you can also find other mini guitars like the Squier Mini Strats or the V-wee. But those guitars, mainly designed for children, not necessarily meant to be a serious instrument. Unless you put a lot of work and custom parts into them, they're just mainly designed for kids to kind of learn on, to inspire them to want to play. But then there's another tier of mini guitars that are more so for like somebody who's just on the road a lot, traveling a lot. They just want something decent to play, but they want it to be, transportable. They don't want to have to lug around a big case. They just want a small little thing, and this is perfect for that. Or perhaps there's a special song by Van Halen that you want to learn to play, like Little Guitars. And I used to suggest people to find a Lotus Mini Les Paul. They're kind of like a late 80s, early 90s thing. I've also reviewed one of those. And besides a few other brands that have done things like that, the only other option that I was aware of is there were 2 of these made in the 50s that are actually legitimate Gibson Gold Tops that are tiny. One of them's in a museum. I believe it's in Wisconsin somewhere. But where does this Edwards fall? Is it for a kid or is it for a professional? This one is for a professional, and it's different from all the other ones for one big reason. It's a set neck construction. All the other ones I've demoed and talk about were bolt-on necks. So this is like the real deal, essentially. So this thing is a 20.5-inch scale length. Just for reference, my Pee-wee is 19 5/8 inches. So it's a little bit smaller, not quite as long as this one. And the Lotus Les Pauls, they usually range anywhere between 19 to 19.5, depending on what factory made them. But you're gonna notice, when I unboxed this, I said they feel like it's a different size, and that's right, this is more of like a medium-sized Les Paul. So we've got the tiny little Pee-wee over here, which was similar in size to the Lotus. I think the Lotus was just slightly bigger. But then you got this thing. It seems gigantic in comparison, doesn't it? And then side by side to a real Les Paul custom, you can tell this thing isn't as small as the pictures make it out to be. I was expecting it to be the same size as like the Pee-wee. So besides having a considerably larger body, and you do have an intonatable bridge and tailpiece, it also has another little built-in feature here. You don't actually have a neck pickup. This is a Speakup. And at first I thought this was just a hilarious kind of broken English thing that made its way onto the guitar, but you gotta think about it. This is a speaker and a pickup at the same time. They just blended those together. It's a Speakup. Personally, I would get rid of that space and just make it all one word, because then I think people would get it quicker. But essentially, this operates on a 9-volt battery, and it has volume and tone controls on the front, just like your regular pickup. So this is not a 3-way switch, it's only a 2-way toggle. It's off and on. So when you turn it on, you don't even have to be plugged into anything. You now have an amp. Now that's with everything on 10. You definitely want to dial this thing back because it's a tiny little speaker, but you can get some decent little clean tones out of it. So is it fantastic by any means? No, it's kind of a little novelty feature, but it is great for the purpose of what this thing was made for, a travel instrument. Because do you really want to lug around anything else besides your guitar? Do you want a tiny little amp with you? No. So this is just, built right into the guitar. As long as you have a 9-volt battery that isn't dead, you're good to go. And one more feature to talk about these is they're made in Japan. There's a little bit of controversy. I'm not an expert, so I'm not really going to weigh in on it. But some people say the bodies and necks are crafted in China, but then shipped back to Japan to be finished. So I'll let somebody that knows a little bit more about this brand chime in on that in the comment section. As with all mini guitars, sometimes tuning stability can kind of be a pain on these things. This one's, one of the better ones. You've got definitely a lot of room to play with intonation and things like that for this one. But your best bet is to put a heavy gauge of strings on here. Like we're talking 13 gauge if you're trying to play in standard tuning. Now, if you don't have super heavy strings, you don't want to cut your nut professionally to accommodate a heavy gauge. What you're going to want to do is tune this G to G on regular strings. That's going to tighten up all the flubbiness and help this thing stay in tune. So that's a step and a half higher than regular. So now that we know a little bit about the history of Edwards guitars and this Mini Les Paul, let's go ahead and throw it on the workbench and take an individual look at its parts and specs. Inside the Edwards Mini Les Paul, I'm really curious what this Speakup looks like. So you take it out and it just looks like a regular pickup, right? But I'm curious if I take the springs out, if we can actually look inside of this. And I was successful. So here's what the pickup cover itself looks like. It's just plastic. It has a bunch of holes drilled into it. But here it is. It's actually just a tiny little speaker right here. It doesn't sound the best, but it's kind of a cool novelty product. I would love to put one of these in a legitimate Les Paul just so I wouldn't have to carry an amp around. I could just practice whenever I would want. So it appears you just have a couple of wires coming from there, and then that goes in within your control cavity. And it's just like regular Les Paul controls here. So this is your neck pickup. So these are your neck pickup controls. So this is the volume of your amp, and this is the tone of your amp. Now I found when it's on 0, it's like a clean tone. But as you turn it up, it's almost acting kind of like a gain knob. It kind of makes it more distorted. And unfortunately, with a tiny little speaker like this, it just kind of sounds like garbage. But it's a nice little novelty effect. It's cool to have. But I find the best way to do this is to even roll the volume of this pickup down, and that really actually gets you more decent tones out of this thing. But in order to use this, you just put the Speakup on, and here it is on. I can show you it's on by tapping the pickup. And if this was my guitar and I was going to keep it, I would totally leave that cover off, because how creepy is that? It just looks like an eye looking at you. I love it because it actually matches the whole gold hardware scheme. That is cool. I had somebody asking in the unboxing episode if you could put a regular neck humbucker in here. And yeah, you can totally do that. It's not like a shallow route or anything. I mean, here's a Gibson PAF in here, and that'll fit just fine once you get this stuff out of the way. The only thing you might have to do is get a new pickup ring, depending what kind of pickup you're trying to put in here, and you might have to drill new hole locations. But as far as the route, it almost kind of looks like a Gibson transitional neck tenon. So it's a short neck tenon, but they have the routing for a longer neck in here. And then nothing too fancy here within the bridge pickup, but the bridge pickup itself, this thing, according to the specs on the website, is called the GH1G. It just looks like a standard cheapy pickup to me. I doubt this will be anything special, but I have not plugged this thing into a real amp yet. But so far, I think it would definitely be worth modding this thing out with some high-end pickups. But continuing on here, as far as the bridge goes, it's an ABR1 in style. You've got the wire that goes over it, and it says it is made in Sungil BM002. I know I've seen that branding before. And it's metric in style, so you can adjust it with a flathead screwdriver. And it sits within a post in the body. Then it's just kind of a regular tailpiece here. It almost kind of looks Gibson in style with the way that they did their marking right there. As far as your control knobs go, you have 4 black speed knobs on this particular model. And this one does have a tiny little pickguard on it. Isn't it cute? It's just white on the back, and it is a multiply thing and feels fairly substantial. And it really does complete the look of this little guy. Just for future reference here, it looks like the top bout is approximately 8 inches, And down here, it's about 11. A regular Les Paul, I believe, is 9 and 13. So that kind of helps you visualize that. And as far as the body being long, it looks like it's about 14 inches, roughly. According to the spec sheets, and from what I can see, it has a real maple top right there paired onto a mahogany body. And you have a traditional rosewood fretboard paired on a mahogany neck. Now, you couldn't normally see the mahogany, but since I took the nut off because it wasn't actually glued into place anyways, there you can see the mahogany spec. But this is a 22 fretted fretboard, but what makes this one even more special, even over the Lotus, besides being a set neck, is you actually get these acrylic block inlays. So it's just something else that makes this thing feel fancy, and you get binding along the neck. But notice, you don't get the fret nibs, so they're not trying to completely steal everything away from Gibson. The nut on this one's actually already been upgraded to a Tusk XL, and I also put some graphite in it, so that's definitely a very welcomed addition on these things. That's one thing that always needs changed on these mini guitars. But moving up here, you just have kind of a Pearloid Limited model right there, kind of playing off of the Les Paul model, and then Edwards with the open book headstock and Keystone style tuners. And your truss rod's in there, it adjusts with an Allen key. You can see from the factory there were a few boo-boos right there. It's not quite level right there, and it almost looks like they drilled the truss rod screw off center at one point in time and then moved it. As far as neck specs go, nut width is 1.65 inches, and that increases to 2.05 at the 12th. First fret neck depth is 0.82, and it chunks up to 0.98 at the 12th. So even though it's a mini guitar, I really did not notice this thing like feeling too tiny until you get into the higher fret registers. That's when this starts to feel a little bit crammed. But within the chording area and just like your basic lead work stuff, it actually feels pretty good, believe it or not. And measuring the scale length, the best way to do it is to take the 12th fret measurement and then double it. So that's about 10 1/4. So that's how I got my 20 1/2 scale length. And that pretty much lines up down here. Moving on to the backside here. In order to operate the amp, you do have to have a 9-volt battery in here. So that's why I have this little guy here. It says Goto made in Japan, and you can see the route in there, and it just secures to the body by those 4 screws. And what's kind of nice about this coming with that is if you wanted to upgrade this with like some EMG pickups, you could easily do that because you already have the battery route in here. So that's kind of a nice little plus. But inside your back control plate cavity here, you've got some shielding here, and I believe this is part of the amp. So if you were to take the amp out, you would be removing this little circuit board. But if you did have plans to completely gut this thing and upgrade it with better electronics, you do have stock 500K mini pots. So if for whatever reason you wanted to upgrade them to CTS full-size pots, it looks like you could just barely get them to fit in there, but you might have to ream the existing holes in order to get the larger shaft in there. Same thing with the toggle switch cavity. It looks like you could just barely get a full-size switch craft in there, but I don't think you'd be able to fit the L-shape style. It would definitely be cutting it close though as far as the depth of the body, which is approximately 1 3/4 inch deep. So there's definitely some interesting modding potential here between what you can do with active pickups, because those active pickups actually use tiny little EMG pots, so you wouldn't have to worry about routing and reaming stuff then. So it is a great candidate if you like those style of pickups. Hey, it's Trogly from the future here. So the tone pot for the pickup was actually broken. And once I found that out after recording a playing demo with it, and I replaced it with a new one that I borrowed from my parts gallery, the sound of this thing really opened up. So the old tone pot must have died when it was like halfway or something, because this whole thing, it even sounds louder through the Speakup now. So I'm definitely glad I did that slight modification to bring it back to 100% functionality. To the best of my knowledge, I think this is the only back-bound mini Les Paul I've ever seen is the Edwards style here. As all the other ones I've reviewed, the Lotus had it on the top, but not the back. And the output jack has a plastic plate, and you do have these large style strap buttons. Moving on to the mahogany neck here, I think my favorite thing about this one is it does have a little volute here. It's just a nice little touch on these guys. And as far as the tuners go, they're kind of Grover in style, but they look like they're made by Goto. They feel pretty good. They're nice and tight. I would not actually worry about replacing these. And the serial number for this one is inked on GW04410205. This mini Les Paul weighs 6 pounds, 6.3 ounces. Let's go ahead and plug it into my Mesa Boogie Mark 525 and hear how it sounds. Alright, so control-wise, it's supposed to be volume tone for your neck, volume tone for your pickup. And that's even what the website says, but I've actually found that the tone for the amp affects the pickup when you have it plugged into a real amp and you're not even using this. So if I have the amp at 0, it sounds like this. But if I turn that up to 10, it gets more of a bassy sound to it. So then you can turn the pickup tone down as well. That sounds a little bit more familiar to with what you're used to on a tone control. So this thing seems to be operating as kind of like a fullness switch in a way. So the rest of the demos is just kind of going to be a combination of everything to show you the potential tonal capabilities of this little guitar. Now that we know all about the Mini Edwards Les Paul, what are my final thoughts on this thing? I was expecting a lot out of this guitar, and it definitely delivered as far as mini guitars go. It was a nice little thing to play. It's definitely ranked right up there with the Lotus, but you know, it kind of has a completely different look to it. It's a little bit more polished and refined and looks closer to what I think a mini Les Paul should look like. And if you don't dig the black Les Paul custom look, you can also get these that look like Les Paul standards. There's a few different iterations out there and finishes, but you gotta remember, these things are discontinued. You can no longer buy them brand new. And their new price was around $500 once you translate it to US dollars. It had all the typical issues of mini Les Pauls. Intonation is a big key. So yes, you can dial in your intonation a little bit better on these because you do have an ABR1 styled bridge. But let me tell you, setting the intonation on this thing is crazy because just the slightest movement jerks it all over the place because it's a tiny little scale length you're playing with here. And you almost want to set it a little bit flat because if you're a heavy-handed guy, these tiny little strings will bend out of tune just by you fretting the note. So if you set that a little bit flat, that can kind of help compensate for that. So you really do have to do a personalized setup on these to your playing style. If you're a heavy-handed guy, set it up a little bit flat. If you're nice and light, set it up the way you would normally do. But as far as tuning stability, it was okay. I mean, somebody's got a brand new nut on here, so it's pretty good in that aspect. The strings are properly wound on the pegs. As far as just doing regular stuff, I thought it was pretty good. But I still noticed doing the bends, once you do like a crazy big bend, it'll definitely come back flat. So about the only other thing that I could think of to help cure that would maybe be to put some graphite in the saddles here and really stretch these strings in because I'm sorry, I didn't have the patience to do that today. So this thing as a travel guitar or an instrument for your kid to learn on, I think that is actually the most appealing thing about this one compared to all the other ones. The others, they kind of feel like a toy in their size, but this one, I feel like your kid wouldn't think of it as a toy, more so as a them-sized Les Paul. So if you need a travel guitar to play around or you just want a mini thing to throw people off on stage, I would highly suggest one of these things for that. It's not necessarily the same level of 100% quality perfection as that Gibson Les Paul laying down on the floor there, but it's definitely not garbage quality either, and I didn't really expect it to, seeing as these things sell for around $500 even on the used market. So if you're interested in this one, it is on consignment, so we're going to go ahead and go over the condition here, and you can check out that link in the description for the Reverb for sale page. So as far as the face of the headstock goes, you just have a few light fingerprints and maybe some minor string change scratches. I didn't really notice anything too wrong on the face of the headstock. The nut has been upgraded from the original plastic one to a Tusk XL. It's not glued into place, but it seems to be fairly secure there. You might consider gluing it down at your next string change so you don't have to worry about it moving on you. The frets only showed minor wear. I just cleaned and polished the frets and fretboard, so you're good to go there. And I conditioned the board as well, so you're good with this rosewood one. And as far as the body goes, you do have quite a few scratches here because it's a black Les Paul. And you're going to notice right there is quite a large little ding right here. It's a small little ding, but it definitely catches your eye, and it appears somebody's touched that up with a lacquer pen or something. That was there before I got it. But other than that, it's just, picking scratches, polishing swirls, and other handling marks. It's by no means a mint condition guitar, but if you took it to a professional buffer, they could probably make this thing look like new. Now, if you're like me and you would like that amp pickup cover removed so you can have that cool eye underneath it, just let me know. I'll gladly take it off for you before I pack it up and ship it. Backside of the headstock, I did not see any major nicks or dings here, so I think you're pretty good as far as condition goes on the neck. I didn't notice any impressions on the back of the neck or anything either. Just basically your fingerprint marks, because, it's a black guitar. They show up. But on the back, you do have some buckle scratches. Nothing through the finish, nothing chipped the finish, but definitely lots of scratches when you get it in the light. But despite this being quite an old guitar already, the original plastic is still over top of the back plates, so all those scratches you see on these guys, you can technically remove that if you want to. The edges are in pretty similar condition. I do want to point out a factory defect. There's like a black paint splotch right here that kind of splattered on the binding. It's not too noticeable, but it is there, and I think you should know about it. Then continuing down here, just, light scratches again. But in this area, there is a little bit of a rough spot right here. I think it's a little bit of sticker residue, or maybe a stand got to it a little bit. But the polishing scratches, and the ding are definitely the worst things condition-wise about this particular Mini Edwards. Under Blacklight, this thing's kind of cool. So your binding is glowing tons. The finish, a little bit, not so much. And then the pickguard glows a little bit, but not quite as much as the binding. This glows a really cool green color. Then, as we kind of saw on some of those other import models, the inlay material that they use also glows, and this time the neck binding also does. So this would be a really cool little stage guitar. That's not the first time we've seen that happen over top of logos either. So, yeah, I don't see any breaks, cracks, or repairs, but yeah, it's basically just a glowing show right here. Cool. If you're interested in being the next owner of this Edwards Mini Les Paul, you've actually got some options here. So we've got the original gig bag that says ESP on it, which will fit the guitar pretty nicely. I mean, it's got a pretty decent amount of padding. I would say this is kind of similar to a Gibson gig bag, if you're familiar with those. But we also have a Gator hardshell case here. This is the one with the TSA latches. I'm not really sure what this case is for, because it's smaller than a regular guitar. And the fact that a Les Paul will just barely fit in it, but it's not actually touching the neck rest, so you would definitely not want to use this for a Les Paul. But it does work for this little mini guy once you add a little bit of additional padding in here. If you think you might be interested in being the next owner of this Mini Edwards Les Paul, you can check out that link in the description, which will take you to the Reverb for sale page. Thank you, Troglodytes, for tuning in today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you tomorrow on the next episode. Take care.